record. Sorry about that. Okay, so welcome everybody. Our speaker today is Paolo Amore from the Universidad de Colima in Mexico. And Paolo is going to tell us about circle packing in regular polygons. So please, Paolo, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really glad that you give me this chance. The main topic is circle packing in regular polygon. This is recent work which I did by myself and with my students here at University of Colima. The outline is going to be, I will first start talking about circle packing in the square. Historically, this is one of the problems that has been explored most. Then I will switch to circle packing regular polygons. I will describe some of the algorithms that we have been working on, and then present some of the results. And eventually, I want to talk to you about some exotic packing that occurs in regular polygon, which we call curved hexagonal packing. This name is borrowed from, this definition is borrowed from Graham and Lubachevsky, that first discovered this kind of packings in the circle. And eventually I will just show you a few slides on a different problem, which is dealing with Coulomb cluster in finite domains, as the circle essentially. Okay, so the basic problem in circle packing in the square is find the smallest square in which you can fit n congruent disk in a way that they can touch but they cannot overlap. Of course, there is an alternative formulation that you can keep the square fixed, the size of the square fixed, and find then the maximum radius of the n congruent disk that you can fit in the square. Of course, without overlapping, but touching. So the quantity that you want to maximize is what is called normally packing fraction, which is the ratio between the area covered by the disk to the total area of the container of the square in this case. The algorithm that I want to first describe was devised a long time ago by Nurmela and Ostergaard, which they used to treat to numerically find packings up to 50 equal circles in a square. So this is a constraint optimization problem. Constraint optimization problems are typically more difficult than unconstrained. The number of possible packings is very large. I would say countless, because in some instances, the one or more disks could be regular. So there is actually an arbitrary number of positions that they can fill. The packing fraction in some cases may change very slightly because from one configuration to another. So that's also a numerical challenge. From the point of view of mathematics, this is a challenging problem. Actually, for the square, rigorous proof of optimality are only available for n smaller than 32. There is, of course, an upper bound to the packing density, which is given by Thew's theorem, which gives you essentially the maximum packing fraction for the whole space, for the whole plane. This is p over square root of 12. Of course, if you have a finite container, geometrical frustration will not get you near to that value for any finite n. And let me just pinpoint to what are the features of Nurmela, so the algorithm of Nurmela and Ostergaard. You work with endpoints which are randomly placed inside the square of given side. You parameterize these points in this way, essentially with trigonometric functions. And you promote these points to being charges, fictitious charges, which interact with some kind of potential whose range is gonna evolve during the algorithm. So you start with a long range, which would be a small s. Small, don't take it literally, because small can be S10 or S5, not necessarily S1 or 1/2. But, and then you, at each stage, you make it bigger, bigger, and bigger. And at each stage, you find an equilibrium configuration. So this is really a very involved process, because you don't actually, like, for example, in the Thomson problem, you actually minimize the electrostatic energy. Here, you indirectly maximize the density. At the end, you end up with a certain density, which, if it is bigger than any previous density that you reach, you keep it. If it is not, you start over the process. So this is the idea of the algorithm. This is one example of configuration for the square. Actually, this was found much earlier. You see two features. Well, you have 7 disks. You see two features. One is a red container, which is the container in which the center of the circles can move, and the blue container, which is the physical container that contains all the disks. Now, with this algorithm, one advantage is that you now have an unconstrained minimization problem, which is, of course, easier to attack, because you don't have to enforce that the disk fit in the square. The other feature is that you don't really work with this, you work with point. And at the end of the algorithm, the minimal distance between any 2 points is the diameter of the disk. So you know the diameter or the size of the disk only at the very end of the algorithm. You don't know it before. One nice thing is that, for example, Nurmela and Ostagar in their paper found that n equal 49 is the first example where the square packing in the square is not optimal anymore. Okay. One of the characteristics, one of the features that you may find possibly problematic is that if you start your algorithm with a too small s, so a very long-range interaction, that could produce an excess of border disk. If you produce at the very early stages of the algorithm too many disks on the outer border, that could be could fail to produce an optimal configuration, because once a point has fallen on the border, there is no way back, right? Because all the forces, the resultant of the forces of all the particles will always point outwards. And so, if the algorithm fails to produce a good configuration with a very decent number of border disks at the beginning, that could produce problems later on. So that's the motivation that that brought us to make a slight upgrade to the algorithm, essentially with this paper that I wrote with my student Tenoch. Essentially, what we did is a simple change, allow that in the first early stages of the algorithm, allow border repulsion. The border behaves as a charge itself, and therefore it doesn't want too many disks or too many points to fall on the border at the very early stages. Later on, when the interaction becomes sufficiently long, short range, this is not anymore a problem. So we did a lot of experiments. For example, here you see some histograms of frequency. The orange one correspond to the modified algorithm. These are several trials that one does and see the corresponding frequency with which a certain density is obtained. So, for example, the blue histogram corresponds to the original algorithm. So the original algorithm can produce dense configuration, but typically it may fail to produce the very largest density. So, and the orange one, which corresponds to this modification of with border repulsion, does help in this case, to produce a denser configuration. This is the one algorithm. And the second algorithm that we did, essentially, the second algorithm, algorithm 2, which we also call it the shaking algorithm, uses essentially the original algorithm, but the starting configuration is not random, can be an evolved configuration from any algorithm, for example, the earlier algorithm or any other algorithm. And essentially, it makes a shaking or perturbation of this configuration, which has to be essentially not too strong or not too small, but is in many cases, it may help you to find, when you evolve this perturbed configuration, help you to find a denser configuration. One example that we found in this paper is the configuration of 3000 circles. So this configuration is reported in Pacomania, the site of Carl Specht. And we did apply the algorithm 2 with a limited number of shakings, and we found a much denser configuration. Here, the color has a meaning. You see this green color, it's related to the number of contacts of each disk. In this case, if I remember correctly, green is 4. The blue, dark blue is 6. Okay, the light blue is 5, and so on and so forth. So essentially, once you do this shaking, you eventually go to a much more disordered configuration, which, however, has much more 6 contacts than 4. Okay, and so that's where you actually gain in density. Okay, so you may now wonder, can I generalize this approach to more general domains? The answer is yes, but because what we have to realize is that the algorithm, I already told you before, the algorithm doesn't use a fixed container. So the blue container that you see here is only fixed at the end. What is fixed is the red container, the container of the center of the disks. Okay, the size of the disk is determined at the very end, and so what you need, if you are doing circle packing in a square, you need that the outer container is also a square, which of course is the case, because if you project along the normal direction of the red container a finite amount, a fixed amount, you do draw the blue container. Okay, but does it work in general? The answer is no. For example, one example is the cross. I did the very same procedure. You imagine that the dark, the black region is the region where the center of the disk can move. You then extend it along the normal, and you get a new container, which is also a cross, but the proportion is not conserved. So you wouldn't be able to do a systematic search for the maximum of the density, because the container is changing at each stage, so you don't know. Okay. Another example is the ellipse. If you do this trick with the ellipse, you get a larger ellipse, but this is not an ellipse with the same eccentricity, because if you rescale, for example, by a factor of 3/2, you get the green ellipse. And if you rescale on the other side, you get the brown ellipse, which are different. So you cannot do this, okay? But of course, you can do it for other containers. And for example, you can surely do it with regular polygons. That's what we did, okay? So of course, square and circle are just, even the circle, you can see it as a special case of a regular polygon. So essentially, the way to generalize the procedure to work with regular polygon is straightforward. You need to parameterize the border in a similar way you did it for the square. It's similar and not the same, because for the square we had a Cartesian kind of parametrization, and here we use a polar-like parametrization. So you see that the sine square of t plays the role of a polar distance, and the other ones plays the role of the angular part, right? So essentially, this t is like a polar variable. It is used like the angular variable. The good thing of putting it like sine square of t is that automatically you are constrained between 0 and 1, okay, which does the trick. So essentially, you can work out all the geometric properties of your domain. Sigma is the number of sides of your polygon. R minus and R plus are the apothem and the circumradius of the polygon. You can work out the perimeter and the area, and essentially you end up with this kind of construction. This is actually the best, the optimal packing of 3 congruent disks inside the regular polygon. Also, same as before, you have a red container, which is a polygon, which is a pentagon in this case, and the blue container, which is also a pentagon. Of course, the size of the blue container, you know, at the end, it depends how big will be the circles contained in the red one. You also get a explicit expression for the packing fraction in terms of the distance, in terms of the radius of these disks, and in terms of the number of disks and of the number of sides. So essentially, from Q's theorem, you can work out a very simple bound for the radius of the disk in terms of the number of disk itself and the number of sides. You can define what I call the packing efficiency, which is the ratio between the maximum, well, between the disk size of the radius of the disk and the very maximum disk size allowed. And another interesting quantity is the border fraction. The border fraction tells you how much of the border is actually covered by packing, okay? This is this actually, it really depends on what kind of polygon you are looking at. Another thing that you can look at is topological charges. You can look at the Voronoi tessellation of the domain, and you will associate in the straightforward way a topological charge to each Voronoi cell, depending on the number of size of the cell. One interesting feature in packing is that apart from the standard topological charges associated with either internal or border cell, you also have frequently some kind of topological charge associated with number higher order vertices. So if you have a vertex with 3 legs, it doesn't carry topological charge. But as soon as you get more legs, you have topological charge. And this in packing is more common than, for example, in the Thomson problem. This is one example. From Euler's theorem, you get that the sum of all topological charges must have add to 6. And here you see the case of 12 charges inside the hexagon. And you can see that there are 1, 2, 3 vertices of order 4, okay? And one other thing that you have to keep in mind that here you would say this is a pentagon. Is not really a pentagon because this vertex can be deformed and to disappear. So I'm counting as vertices only the ones that are true vertices. This is not a true vertex, okay? So it doesn't, this is actually a quadrilateral. So some examples, these are a few examples for dodecagon. Up to 7, and then these are the Voronoi diagrams. You can see that suddenly you have higher order vertices. Here, of course, the coloration has to do with the number of vertices of the Voronoi cell. This is an hexagon, so it is this dark blue, and these are quadrilateral. One of the things that one observes is that there are some, especially for the hexagon and the triangle, equilateral triangle, there are some kind of magic numbers. These are triangular numbers for the equilateral and the hexagonal number for the hexagon. The case of the equilateral triangle has been studied in depth by Graham and Lubachevsky some time ago, and actually they found nine, counting overall 9 different family of patterns in the equilateral triangle, patterns that seems to survive to large n. There are additional families that I found for the hexagon. I'm not going to present it there here, but essentially this is, for example, the best family for the triangle, equilateral triangle. It corresponds to a perfect triangular packing in the triangle for these magic numbers, triangular numbers. For the hexagon, it's similar, but the magic numbers are these hexagonal number 3k, k plus 1 plus 1. K is goes from 1 to whatever number. So if you look at the border fraction, for example, this is a comparison of different polygons, the triangle, the square, the hexagon, and the dodecagon. The dodecagon is only up to 200. You can see that they all display large peaks, which are an effect of these families that I told you. And they have a very alternating behavior. This is not so much true for other domains, where actually in these domains, the dodecagon is plotted again, and the dodecagon actually has some peaks, but more generally, these domains do not have such sharp behaviors. And also for the other ones with the odd number of sides. This is the number of border disk as a function of for a function of n for different polygons. You can see that actually what you could have expected, that the triangle and the hexagon are the ones that allow more efficiently to pack the border, the other ones not so efficiently. Okay. So another interesting feature is that there are configurations which I call necklaces, that are configuration in which you can do a traveling salesman problem and end up with a closed contour that has precisely the length of 2nr. It's like you were actually putting a necklace inside the container. This is a kind of rare configuration. This is the largest one I found for the octagon and the larger ones I found for the pentadecagon. In general, they are very rare, but they are not so rare for the triangle and for the hexagon, even for the square. But in general, not so many configurations are necklaces. For the dodecagon, there are, and I will show you what they are. Okay, so necklaces are not very common. You can think this as a result of the fact that it effectively depends on the kissing number. The kissing number in the plane is 6. In the volume in 3D is 12, and so on and so forth. Actually, I did some experiment of packing in hypercubes, and it turns out that it's much more common in higher dimension, as it should be. But one of the things that I got stuck when I got impressed when I was doing this is that there were some kind of very nice configuration that were emerging from the numerical simulation. So I got involved with my students. I told to my students if they could help me. And we started to first run a lot of simulation to find as many as possible. So we immediately saw that these configuration were corresponding to not to any regular polygon, to polygons which had a multiple of 6 sides. And then even for a given n, if they will appear a certain n, and for a given n, there could be many configurations. Actually, we got an idea that the growth could be very large. Numerically, it was immediately clear that it was very difficult to produce them all. One thing that we realized is that this is something that had already been observed by a long time ago, Graham and Lubachevsky, but in the circle. they find out that in the circle, there are actually this configuration, and these, they call them curved hexagonal packing. This is one example from their paper. This is the hexagon, the perfect triangular packing in the hexagon, and this is its cousin in the circle. Eventually, in the circle, they disappear. Actually, the next configuration in the circle would be 127. It's not anymore a global maximum of the density. So they are still there, but they are not good anymore. So we started thinking about this problem, and we managed to solve it. At least we consider that we solved it. So the first thing is that we look at this domain. This is actually the fundamental region. You are looking at the polygon, with 6J sides. And this is the fundamental domain. So by rotation of this domain, you produce all the whole domain. And you can see we have several angles. This angle corresponds to the angle of the red dots, which correspond to the centers of the disk that you put on the border of the domain. Eventually, you need to get to this vertex, because then everything repeats. So this gives you a condition, this condition here, and this condition actually manages to calculate an explicit formula for the diameter of the disks, which is also a supplemental condition, which is this one, in terms of sigma, which is the number of sides. So in this way, you are able to calculate explicitly the density of this configuration if they exist. And essentially for the circle corresponds to taking the limit sigma to infinity. We reproduce the results of Graham and Lubachevsky, which is this for the disk at infinitely large n. This is the density, which is the square of the density. It's a mathematical curiosity. This is the square of the density in the plane. Okay, so it's lower. Now, for a polygon with sigma size and k shell, k is also the number of shells in the packing. You have k angles on the fundamental region on the border. These angles you calculate univocally at the beginning, and they are unique for this n. What you see from numerical calculation, what we saw is that we had a clue that for the dodecagon, the growth would be of this kind. This was at the time a numerical clue, but we didn't have stronger evidence than that. But then we actually managed to understand better the problem. Let me, instead of going through all the details, let me illustrate how it works on this example. So in this example, you see a configuration with k equals 6, which is the number of disks going from the border to the center with the exclusion of the center disk. And you can see that there are 1, 2, 3 occupied vertex in the fundamental region. The fundamental region is this one, is a region of width, angular width pi over 3. Okay, so imagine that you make a path from this vertex to the center. Okay, this is the path. But you can do it from this vertex to the center, and you can do it from this vertex to the center. So essentially, what you will see is that each of these 3 paths correspond, we associate letters to each of these legs. The letter A, B, and C are associated to the values of the angle of each leg with the horizontal side. And you actually see that if you rotate the container by sitting it on this vertex or on this vertex, you have essentially produce a different configuration, an equivalent configuration, but with a different lexicographic code. Lexicographic code represents this, for example, this first lex is AABBCC, because these are the smallest angle legs, then the middle angle legs, and then the larger angle legs. And this is a CCAABB because of the angles. Okay, so essentially we call this DNA because essentially this AABBC is a unique sequence that you can use to characterize your packing in the domain. The other ones are equivalent. They are not. Once you have equivalent configuration, you always get as a reference the one with lowest lexicographic order. So essentially, there is to build all the configuration. We made based on observation. We made a conjecture. And this conjecture actually worked. We don't have a mathematical proof, but if we call psi the angles, these angles between these legs and the horizontal, we call it psi. Actually, the conjecture is that these psi's are permutations of the phi's plus p3. Any permutation of the phi. So, of course, there can be permutations that are equivalent. So, for example, reflection inverse the lexicographic order, that's not a new configuration. There can be a configuration which have occupied vertices. So, these occupied vertices, if I rotate suitably the domain, it will give me another configuration, but essentially equivalent. Then, if the reflection generates a previously obtained configuration, then I will have essentially had to discard this configuration. And with this consideration, we managed to work out this formula. This is the general formula for a curved hexagonal packing in a regular polygon with sigma size, depending on the number of occupied vertices, depending on this theta, which is related to reflection. And like for example, in this configuration that I show you here, there are only 3 kinds of angles, and each one with 2 elements in each. So essentially, you have to take out this equivalence. Okay, so in this way, we managed to define, to work out a deterministic algorithm. The previous algorithms have a random ingredient, but this one is completely deterministic. You identify the border points of the CHP. You pick a particular permutation of your angles. And then you start filling. Let me show you an example. You put the disk on the border. You first fill the shell. Then you go to this point here, and you put in this way with this compass construction. You put the next disk. You actually build this skeleton that you know from the conjecture, and then you start filling. You start filling until you get to the very top. Once you fitted this fundamental region, you rotate it to produce everything. So let me show you an effectively how it works. Okay, so this is how it works. Now, I can show you. Oops, I can show you for the dodecagon and the octadecagon some of the we calculated all this configuration. Here is the number of configuration that we got from our deterministic algorithm for the different number of shell, and this is the general formula we derived. Okay, so it matches. We did it up to polygons of 60 size. The largest families that we calculated had more than 20,000 elements. Is really huge. And let me show you an animation that shows you the dodecagon for, let's see, why it's not working. Once. don't know why it's not working. 1 second. Okay, the dodecagon, the second animation is not, it was working before, but apparently, let me see. No, something's not working properly. I passed this animation to Adil, so maybe he can show it later. There are still a few things that I want to say. One of the things that we found out that there are also curved hexagonal packing. These are very special configuration. We've just found 2 in polygons which are not which have not 6J sides. This is the nonagon, and this is the polygon with 27 sides. Just for 37 disks, we found out that there are CHP. This is particular because the container is not invariant under P/3, but the configuration is, so it's not expected. And there are other kind of hexagonal configuration. This wouldn't be really CHP, it would be like more hexagonal because this is a perfect hexagonal packing inside. And then we also did an experiment which a much bigger configuration is really fast to produce configuration, CHP configuration, very large N. This is 1,657 disk. And actually, this is quite not optimal, but we did apply to this configuration the algorithm 2, 1 iteration, and we got a much denser configuration. So the bottom line here is that you can use very symmetric configuration as a useful answer at the beginning of a bigger calculation. Another observation is that if you look at the Voronoi structure, the original one had a lot of squares, okay, this green region. The new one has expelled most of the topological charge to the border. Okay, that makes sense because you want to maximize packing. And finally, just to conclude, this is just few images from something that I'm doing with my student Ulises. Ulises is going to graduate in 2 weeks. And we have been studying essentially Coulomb cluster in a disk. And we are focused on trying to build very large N configuration. So this is what we got so far. These are very nice behaviors and very nice Voronoi structure. And these are the conclusions. Of course, a good part of this work was done in collaboration with my student, and that's it.
Paolo, thank you very much for an absolutely stupendous talk. Thank you, thank you. Thank you from me, and thank you on behalf of everybody listening. I think I can play that movie, but maybe we'll have questions first, and then we'll see about running the movie, because I don't want to upset things just right now on the setup. So guys, please come in with your questions. I'm sure you've got plenty